everything is meaningless, and it's the only purpose I have here is to make my own life enjoyable.
Why don't you commit suicide?
Because that would not be enjoyable.
How do you know?
Because I've seen what it's done to other people around them that they love, and that certainly was not enjoyable for them.
How do you know that the person who committed suicide was not in so much pain that suicide was a reprieve from that pain?
That's certainly possible, but that is not the case for me. Okay, if there was a God and that would mean that we are only not killing each other and acting in chaotic ways because we fear God and that we fear punishment or we desire, I guess, to go to heaven? Sir,
the reason I, as a follower of Christ, respect you is not because I am afraid of God. It's not because I'm afraid I might go to hell. It has nothing to do with it. The reason I respect you is because you're worthy of respect. You have innate value. You're not just an accident. You're a human being created by God for a purpose. God loves you, and when I look into your face, I'm looking into the face of a person who God loves so deeply that he sent his only son, Christ, to bleed and die on a cross for you. That's how much he treasures you. And if I demean you, if I'm disrespectful to you, that is absolute denial of your intrinsic innate value. It's a denial of reality.
Okay, I would have to say that people are deserving of respect because they are your equals, because we are all accidents in the same exact way. We don't have any purpose instilled into us. We just all are by accident, and therefore, since we are all from the same accident, and we desire to continue our peaceful society, that is where our morality stems from.
Okay, now my point to you is, do you think you can really live out what you just said? Because if what you just said is true, when that young lady looks you in the face and says, I love you, what you understand is, she doesn't have the foggiest idea what she's talking about, because life is meaningless. So she's just spewing out some words, and it's all meaningless.
It's not meaningless. She still has those feelings and those interactions going on in her body. She's telling me what her feelings are inside. It's not us having a purpose doesn't mean that she can't still have emotions.
Yeah, but those emotions are meaningless. They're totally random. And what she really means is you're hot, and therefore I, quote, love you. And when you say to her, I love you, what you really mean is you're hot. So let's see if we can couple. And that's all there is to really reality. And it's all meaningless, but you can have sex, you can copulate, but it's ultimately meaningless. And that's all life is.
Well,
and that's the despair of atheists.
Well, without God, it doesn't mean that love is for some reason based only on physical attraction. And also, everything is in essence meaningless. There's no real purpose unless there was the existence of God, and I've still yet to see anything that would convince me of that. So to me, everything is meaningless, and it's the only purpose I have here is to make my own life enjoyable.
Why don't you commit suicide?
Because that would not be enjoyable.
How do you know?
Because I've seen what it's done to other people around them that they love, and that certainly was not enjoyable for them.
How do you know that the person who committed suicide was not in so much pain that suicide was a reprieve from that pain?
That's certainly possible, but that is not the case for me.
Okay, but Albert Camus, the brilliant atheist philosopher, put it brilliantly when he said, when you begin to seriously consider the meaninglessness of life, which you've been articulating, I think, very well and very consistently, and I respect you for it, you've been consistent. When you seriously consider the meaninglessness of life, then the only question you really have to answer is, why not commit suicide? Because when you struggle with the meaninglessness of life, you begin to realize that pleasure, or your happiness, as you referred to, is ultimately meaningless. If my pleasure comes from murdering people, if I start murdering people in cold blood here, that's my definition of happiness. That's how I get my jollies, by murdering people. If I get my jollies from feeding homeless people, starving people, well, that's equally meaningless, but that's the way I get my jollies, from feeding starving people, so I do that. And when you begin to think about that long enough, you begin to realize it really doesn't matter whether I slit his throat or feed him dinner. It's all meaningless. So it really doesn't matter what I do. And when you begin to think about that long enough, you begin to realize that Camus is right when he says, you better struggle through. Why should I continue to suck wind? Why not commit suicide?
I guess if you go to the point where you slit someone's throat or you give them dinner, it doesn't matter in a sense that anything matters. But it's still, that would hurt other people, and while it's making you happy, that's why I see that as injustice, and that's why you should still be punished for it. Now, it does make you happy, and not that I recommend doing it. I mean, you can go ahead and try if that's the only thing that makes you happy, but I'm thinking that the repercussions of those actions are going to make you much less happy than you were beforehand.
Okay, but I think where you're beginning to go is, Cliff, I really don't think it's all meaningless. I think if you do go out and just murder people, that there really is something wrong there. Aren't you beginning to move in that direction?
It's meaningless in the sense that we don't have a purpose, but as a society, it is still a negative influence. And it certainly isn't desirable because it hurts our society, and thus it hurts the, the happiness of society as a whole.
All right, how do you and me giving money to support handicapped people help society? Why don't you buy into eugenics? Why shouldn't we wipe out all handicapped people because they are a drain on our limited resources?
Well, they have people that love them, and that would hurt the people that love them, and it would hurt the handicapped people as well. Hurting other people doesn't make me happy. So.
Are you ever going to spank your children?
I haven't come to that crossroads yet. I was spanked as a child, and I would say it had more positive impacts on me than negative.
Good. I think you're finding it very difficult to live a meaningless life. I think you insist upon attaching a great deal of meaning to your family life. I think you're grateful for some of the values that your parents had and held to rather strongly in loving you and disciplining you. I don't think you're just saying it's all really meaningless. The reason I say that God cannot be explained by science is because of my definition of science. Science is based on the repeatability of an experiment. If you say it is something scientifically true, and we've proven it here at this fine university, but if you can't do those same experiments in London or in New York, you don't have science. Scientific knowledge is based on the repeatability of an experiment. So God is not a physical being or a physical process that you can observe and then repeat an experiment over and over again. Not only is that true, but that's true of your family. You don't scientifically prove your family. You develop trust relationships with your family, but you don't scientifically prove people. You learn to trust them. So science is a study of process, how the organism works, and it's based on the repeatability of an experiment. But a human being is not a scientific project. In order to develop a relationship with a person, you learn to trust them and build a friendship. And then when it comes to God, God is not a scientific equation. God is a personal being who creates, but who's not a physical process that you can dissect, observe, and then repeat the experiment over and over again.
But clearly, doesn't the Bible say God's everywhere and God's force is, all around us? So if clearly, basically you're suggesting that there's a force out there which is actively manipulating our world, well, clearly that force must be somehow detectable. That's a pretty significant force. And also, you're proposing very scientific hypotheses, where the universe came from, where life came from, the origin of the earth. Those are all very scientific questions. You can't just say, if religion has one answer and science has another, well, which one's right? It has to be put to the scrutiny of science, does it not?
Absolutely not. All right, I'm going to work hard here and try and communicate clearly. Science is a very narrow branch of knowledge. Science is based on studying the physical process and repeating experiments over and over again to find out if there is a law of nature, a scientific law that can be understood. Historical knowledge is totally different, radically different. You do not get Abraham Lincoln back on this campus every September and have him assassinated by John Wilkes Booth in order to prove that Lincoln was truly assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. Instead, historical knowledge is based on not the repeatability of an event or the repeatability of an experiment. Historical knowledge is based on the trustworthiness of eyewitness testimony. Somebody saw Lincoln assassinated. They recorded it. And you study it, not in your science lab, you go over to your history department to study history. Because it's a different form of knowledge.
Right. I would agree that science can't answer philosophical questions. I'm not trying to say it would, and I can't answer historical questions. I'm not saying it would. So if you were saying that Jesus was a philosopher, if he was a man who was trying to give a way of life, then yes, science can't go one or another. I mean, that's a different branch of knowledge. But to say Jesus rose from the dead, it happened in our physical universe, thus it must have a physical explanation, and thus it is the topic of science, and to prove something that physically happened. If I say I flew through the air, well, there must be a physical reason why that happened, and then that can be a subject of science.
Okay. The Gospels record that Jesus physically rose from the dead.
Right.
And people ate food with him. They grabbed hold of him and saw that he had flesh and bone. But they did not give us a scientific description of how physically he rose from the dead. So we do not have a scientific description of how the dead body came alive again.
Right.
Now, the question of origin, meaning by that, is there an intelligent mind behind this universe, or is there not an intelligent mind? I am convinced is not a scientific question. It is a philosophical, theological question. So you have to use reason, not a scientific process, to conclude whether God exists or not. And the philosophical, rational way I go about it is by asking myself, is it more reasonable to believe that behind order and design there's an intelligent mind, or is it more reasonable to believe that order and design comes about by chance? Is it more reasonable for me to believe that in light of the fact that the universe has a beginning, that there's an uncaused cause, or is it more reasonable to believe it just happened? Is it more reasonable to believe that the ductus arteriosus, that little flap of skin that comes down in every one of our bodies when we pass down our mother's birth canal and switches the blood from going around the lungs to going through the lungs, that kind of amazing order and design, is it more plausible for me to believe that that happened by chance, or is it more reasonable for me to believe there's got to be a mind behind that? When I'm confronted by moral absolutes, like the slaughter of innocent children is wrong, is it more reasonable, based on my experience and observation, to believe that that's just relative morality, it's not objective? Or is it more reasonable for me to believe the slaughter of innocent children is absolutely, objectively wrong? If it is absolutely, objectively wrong, there's got to be a mind prior to the human mind that defines what's right and what's wrong. Because if there is no mind prior to the human mind that defines right and wrong, it's obviously the human mind that defines it, and it's all relative.
I mean, I would agree that I would think I'm relatively consistent, and I would say it's all relative, in that I personally see, obviously, the slaughter of children as horribly wrong, but that is through my mind. Lions permit infanticide, and that's how it's actually evolutionarily beneficial for them to commit infanticide, and they obviously don't see it as wrong. But we, as humans, we evolved compassion, and when I see innocent people being harmed, that physically makes me feel sick, and so thus I'm going to try and do what I feel is right in my mind, and I don't think that necessarily has to come from a God. I'm just behaving how my mind was set up to behave.
What is compassion?
What is compassion?
Mm-hmm. You said it. So what did you mean when you said compassion? You said we evolved compassion.
Right.
What is compassion? What does that mean when you say we evolved compassion?
Well, I guess I would say compassion is a feeling of sympathy towards other people, people outside of yourself. I would say, would be a feeling of, I guess you feel sorry for them, you connect with them, you feel empathy towards other people besides yourself. And that is a baffling question, because most people, evolution typically talks about survival of the individual, who's the strongest, who can pass on more offspring. But for humans, we work better in groups. We're group animals, and thus to feel connection towards your brothers allows you to work together with them, allows you to not kill them, allows you to not steal from them, and thus create something better and stronger. And thus, lone animals have no problem harming others, and it's all about themselves, and that's their survival mechanism. But our survival mechanism is to work together, and that's why we do feel compassion. And so I don't see why it necessarily has to come from God.
Okay. I am convinced that I don't have to be compassionate. I am convinced I can be totally self-absorbed, totally narcissistic. I'm convinced that I could live a life of ripping as many people off to feather my nest in the suburbs.
If I were to shuffle a deck of cards, it's more than 1 in 1 trillion in a chance that I shuffle it and it ends up in the order that it ends up in. We might then say that there must be an intelligent actor that put those cards in that order. However, it's just a random shuffling of 52 cards that came up in a very improbable result. Now, obviously, there's no intelligent design behind that. Obviously, it's just a random occurrence. It's extremely unlikely, but the law of large numbers tells us that these sort of things do happen, and the fact that they happen isn't necessarily miraculous. And because it's not miraculous, we don't need to speculate about these things that don't make any kind of physical sense.
I haven't detected a question, so you
My question
any
then
statement
is,
you want to make.
So I'm just questioning your argument here that just because it's unlikely that we're here, there must be some kind of miracle that caused it to happen.
Oh, all I'm saying is, in my observation of reality, life comes from life. It does not come from non-life. Therefore, it's more plausible for me to believe, in the beginning, a living being, God, than it is for me to believe, in the beginning, inanimate matter produces animate life. Secondly, from all of my observation, the rational comes from the rational. The rational does not come from the non-rational or the irrational. July 1883, Charles Darwin wrote a letter to a man named Mr. Graham. In this letter, Charles Darwin writes, "In light of the fact that my brain is simply a highly developed monkey's brain, why should I trust my brain to tell me the truth about reality? Would you trust the thoughts of a monkey?" I respect Darwin. He was struggling with epistemological nihilism. Why do you trust your mind to tell you the truth about reality? The reason that I trust my mind to tell me the truth about reality is because I'm convinced that behind my mind is a rational being, a creator God. So, life comes from life, not from non-life. Reason comes from reason, not from non-reason or the irrational. Consciousness comes from consciousness, not from unconsciousness. So that is why it's more plausible for me to believe God exists than it is for me to believe there's no God. Does that make any sense?
I follow what you're saying. I think I have a number of problems along the way. The first of which is that you're saying now that God is a living being.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, does that mean that God can die?
Because God is eternal, all-powerful, self-sustaining, no, God cannot die.
All right, so then what does it mean to be alive?
What does it mean to be alive?
Uh-huh.
It means to be an animate being who is able to produce, to be creative.
Okay, so death is not a necessity to be alive. You don't have to die.
No.
All right. So have you ever experienced something that was alive that never died? Have you ever experienced that?
No.
So then would you say that all living things must die because you've never experienced a living thing that has not died?
No.
All right.
I've got to be open to the possibility that there is a being who is eternal.
Okay, all right. Okay, we'll go with that for a moment. All right, so then now that you're saying that even though you haven't experienced a living being that has not died, we still have to be open to that possibility. Obviously, you think that there is a living being that has not died. All right, I've never experienced life coming from non-life, but I haven't experienced everything, and I must know that it is possible for life to come from non-life. And it's not out of reason to believe that life came from non-life, especially if you're a materialist or a physicalist, and you believe that most things can be explained, or all things can be explained by natural phenomenon. It's no more of a jump in logic to say that life came from non-life than it is to say that there's a living being that cannot die. They're the same type of logic, do you understand?
A very good point, but no, I strongly disagree. My observation is life does not come from non-life.
No, I understand.
The reason does not come from irrational or the non-reason.
Okay.
Therefore, it is more plausible for me to believe that we come from a living being, that our rational minds are gifts from a rational being, than it is reasonable for me to believe that we come from non-life.
So then by that same logic, I find it more plausible to believe that if there is a God, and he is living, that he will die, and therefore he's not eternal.
That's not true.
How do you
Because
know that
when we talk about God, we're talking about a being of a radically different order than Homo sapien or an animal. Radically different. When we begin to think about the vastness of the universe, it's like looking at a beaver dam. Obviously, when you look at a beaver dam, you know that it wasn't stream bringing sticks down that made the beaver dam. But then when you go to the Golden Gate Bridge, you know, the beavers didn't make the Golden Gate Bridge. Why? Because the level of complex design is such that it requires more than a beaver's brain to put it together. It takes a human mind. Then when you go from the Golden Gate Bridge to the universe, you are taking such a quantum leap. It's incredible. And it demands a mind that is far superior to the human mind.
I don't think that that's true. Look, you're applying double standards here. The difference between your side and my side is that when I come to any kind of improbability, right, you tell me that my side is irrational and that it doesn't make sense. However, when we point out an irrationality in your side of the logic, you take this double standard and say that we're talking about something that can't be explained. We're talking about something that we can't understand. We're talking about something that is of higher order, higher rationality, however you want to word it. And then it's sort of a cop-out against the argument. What I'm saying is that there's an imparallel between what I'm saying and what you're saying, and thus I can't effectively have a point with you if you're just going to tell me that when we find a flaw in your logic, it can be explained away, but if there's a flaw in my logic because you haven't experienced it, therefore it mustn't make any sense. All I'm saying is that, look, if we analyze it in the way that you're analyzing it, and I'm applying the same kind of logic that you're applying, I'm not trying to have any kind of sleight of hand here, right? You're just saying that you've never experienced life coming from non-life. I'm saying that I've never experienced a living being that's not died, right? And if God isn't eternal, then it's obviously not the God that's been written about in the Christian Bible, for instance. Okay, so we might as well just evenly doubt the fact that life could come from non-life, just as much as we doubt that the Bible talks about the real God, if there is a God in the first place.
You can conclude that all you want. I'm saying that my experience is...
I'm saying the same thing. Yeah, you understand that I'm applying the same logic that you are?
No.
In my experience, I've never seen a living being that's...
Yeah, I understand that point, but that's not the entirety of my point about God. A big part of my point about God is there has to be a mind that is so superior, not just to the beaver's mind, but to the human mind in creating a universe, that I've got to be open to a being who is so much bigger than I am. It's incredible. And that also this being could be eternal.
Because I've heard you over here for the last couple of days, and a lot of things that you base yourself upon is moral absolutism. So, in fact, I do consider myself a moral relativist. So, obviously, because I'm a moral relativist, I do not need God in my life. So, so then I just have a couple of questions that I want to direct towards you concerning moral relativism. Okay, you say morality is absolute, but my first question to you is, and one of the favorite examples that you like to use is there a time when the rape of a woman is acceptable? Well, my answer to that would be, well, not more than a couple of centuries ago, raping of a woman was considered to be spoils of war, which meant that until somebody stood up and said, hey, we should not do this anymore, raping of a woman for spoils of war was considered an acceptable practice. So my question to you is if morality is absolute, then why does it change?
Great question. When I say that there are a few moral absolutes, I am not saying that everybody follows those absolutes. obviously God has given us a free will, which means that obviously we can rationalize evil, or we can accept our society's definition that rape is okay as a spoil of war, or slavery is okay because it greases the economic wheels of our culture. But that doesn't change the fact that we have consciences that tie us into objective morals. And the only way there can be an objective moral is if there is some mind prior to the human mind that has defined what that moral is. If there's no mind prior to the human mind who defines what objective morality is, then it's obviously people who define morality, which means it's relative depending upon which person you're talking to.
Okay, then, but then you seem to talk from a perspective where you're saying, but I have reached this moral absolute. Or, I mean, my question to you is then, what keeps people, like, decades from now looking back upon this time period and saying, that person was not living out what's morally absolute? What keeps them from doing that? Because at this time period of a couple of centuries ago where that was a accepted practice, people didn't think of it as anything wrong. So obviously you don't think of some of the things that you support as wrong. So what keeps people from saying that in the future?
Okay, I am convinced that just because I don't think something's wrong does not make it wrong. In other words, I'm convinced that I don't create reality. The challenge for me is to get in touch with reality. Let's say that I think that racism is good. That doesn't make racism good, just because I think that. My thoughts can be wrong. I am convinced that all people have equal value, but all ideas do not have equal value. Some ideas are true, other ideas are false. And the idea that racism is good, I am convinced, is a false idea. Wrong idea.
Okay. But then, so then in that context, so let's bring up like a major moral issue, which is abortion, between the choice of a woman and the life of a child. Like, how do you determine which one is right based on moral absolutes?
Okay, great example. Abortion. If abortion is simply removing excess skin, I think it's hard to make a case that abortion is wrong. If abortion is murdering a child, I think the majority of us would agree that murdering children is not good. So the first thing you have to do is you have to answer the question, what is abortion? Is it simply removing excess skin? Nothing wrong with removing excess skin. Or is abortion terminating a human life motivated by inconvenience?
Point of view, I believe every decision we make is based off a combination of chemical reactions and forces inside our brain. If you wanted to, I know your purpose out here is to, I guess, show people your point of view and to kind of convert people into your thinking by showing them your rationale. But to convert people like me, you would need something extremely physical and something you can actually point to and test. You can't point to a concept.
The line of thinking you just gave me is self-defeating, because all that you have done so far with me is not use science in this discussion. You have only used reason and logic. So when you say to me, unless you can show something to me scientifically, meaning by that physically, I can't believe in it, you're contradicting yourself, because everything that you have done so far with me today has nothing to do with physical. It has to do with reason and logic. And you can't take reason and logic and put them in a test tube. Rather, reason and logic are the ability to think and follow along a line of thought logically, reasonably. That's a wonderful way to understand truth. And I can also promise you, when you go into your science lab, that is also another wonderful way to discover truth. But I can promise you, it is different. Science has to do with the repeatability of an experiment. And it's a very physical process, and it's a great process. But what you have done with me so far has nothing to do with science. It has everything to do with philosophy, reason, and logic, none of which is material or physical.
I guess I just have a problem believing in something, into an entity that you can't possibly perceive without foregoing all your scientific knowledge.
Sir, there is absolutely no contradiction between science and love, science and justice, science and God. No contradiction. But obviously, here's the mistake too many Americans make. The mistake is to think, unless I can scientifically prove something, it's not true. That is self-refuting. Please scientifically prove to me that unless you can scientifically prove something, it's not true. You can't do it. Please scientifically prove to me that unless you can scientifically prove something, it's not true. You cannot do that. Instead, what you've got to do is you've got to be honest enough with yourself to say, I just contradicted myself. Science is a wonderful branch of knowledge, but there are other forms of knowledge that are even more precious to me in this life, like goodness, integrity, love, forgiveness, like what those Amish people did towards Charles Roberts and his family. I mean, how do you go on a scientific date? That would be very boring. Very boring. How do you run a family scientifically? That would be incredibly hollow, trite, trivial family. So yes, science is very important, but good gracious, there's so much more to truth and to reality than simply science.
I would have to repeat and say, you'd have to prove that to me, because right now, forgiveness, love, justice, all that can still be interpreted as complex combinations of reactions inside your brain and your body. It's not only a concept that given to us by some God that we can't see or perceive in any way.
Do you really think you base your life on proof?
I base my life on things that I can perceive.
How do you know that your perception tells you the truth about reality?
It's all I have to base it on.
Can you prove to me that we're having this discussion right now?
I can only prove to you that we're having this discussion in the context of my mind speaking to something else.
Good. So you can't prove to me that I'm not just a bad dream you're having right now.
Absolutely not.
Right. So I might just be a bad dream you're having right now. But the evidence is that we are having this discussion, and that's why I think you've trusted me enough to keep talking to me. That's how we make decisions, I find, in life. We don't base our lives on proof. You can't prove to me that your roommate's not going to stick a knife in your back tonight as you lie asleep on the bed. It's possible. But the evidence is your roommate is not that type of warped character. That's why you don't check his back pocket for a knife before you go to sleep. Evidence. We don't base our lives on proof. We base our lives on evidence.
Of course, but introducing that question, I did say I didn't base my beliefs on proof. I based it on evidence and my perceptions.
Good. And so what I would ask you to do is to examine, to observe your experience of life, your outrage over the slaughter by a serial killer of people in Cleveland, Ohio, your moral outrage over the abuse of an innocent child, your respect for a Gandhi, a Dr. Martin Luther King, your respect for a highly trained medical doctor who can help people by performing surgery that brings healing. Look at all of reality. Look at how people do that which is good and kind, and at other times how people do that which is warped and evil. And then ask yourself, what is the best description of what I observe? And I think what you'll find that the description of Christ regarding we have incredible talents to do great good, and we have this incredible fascination with evil and narcissism is accurate. It's spot on. My tests are 4 in number: internal consistency, literary style, archaeological evidence, and manuscript evidence. First one, internal consistency. Whenever I read any document that claims to be historically accurate, I'm a skeptic, but not a cynic. And so I look for contradictions within this historical record. If the contradictions exist, my skepticism rises. If there's an internal consistency, I begin to trust the document a little bit more. Second test, literary style. is the literary style of the document, once upon a time in the land of Nod, Wynken, Blynken, and Odd took a boat ride. That's not historical narrative. That's fairy tale. So if it's fairy tale as a literary style, I'm not going to trust it to give me accurate historical information. But when you read the Gospels, you'll notice the literary style is historical narrative. At this time, in this place, with these people around, Jesus said this, he did that. Third test, archaeology. Was Jesus born on the island of Atlantis? If he was, I got a problem with the text, because archaeology does not verify the existence of the island of Atlantis. But in reality, Jesus was born, according to the Gospels, in Bethlehem, archaeologically verifiable. Fourth test. How do we know that we have what those guys wrote nearly 2,000 years ago? Have you ever played the game telephone? You sit in a circle, you whisper a secret into the ear of the person next to him, they whisper it into the ear of the person next to them, and by the time the secret reaches the end of the circle, it's totally perverted. Yes, I have played that game. No, that is not how we have the Gospels handed down to us. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that we have today are right from the original Greek, which is the language they were written in. We have over 5,200 Greek manuscripts or pieces of manuscript, all agreeing to a very precise detail. So the manuscript evidence for the veracity of the Gospels historically is overwhelming. So I just read the Gospels as history, and that's what I ask all you to do. Read the Gospels as history and ask yourself, does the historical evidence of the way Jesus lived, taught, died, and rose from the dead point to his credibility or not?
On the subject of internal consistency, the Bible isn't actually all that great at that. I could give you some examples if you like.
Yeah, let's stick with the Gospels, okay?
All right. So here's the story of the birth of Jesus. You mentioned that yourself, how he was born in Bethlehem. If we go to the Gospels to look at this, to see what the Gospels have to say about the birth of Jesus, only 2 of the Gospels actually say anything about it. The rest of them pick up as he is an adult.
Yep.
And the 2 stories given are incompatible. In one story, Jesus is born, and then Herod, who has been given warning of this event, he decides to massacre the children. And to avoid this, Jesus and his mother flee to Egypt, and then later they go to Nazareth. But in the other one, Jesus is born, and then they stay there for 40 days to, there's some event, I think, that they're staying for, and then they go to Nazareth. So we see an inconsistency.
Okay. What do you think history is? Do you think there's any book on any portion of history that includes every detail of what happened?
No.
Good. So you agree with me that history is a selective account of what happened?
Yes.
Okay. That's what you have in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You have 4 independent accounts that are selective accounts of what happened. It's like this. You and I are standing down on Guadalupe. We see 2 cars coming down the road. We hear a screech of brakes. We hear a woman scream, and then there's a collision. You and I go to the police department. You say, "Officer, I saw the 2 cars coming down the street. I heard a screech of brakes. There was a collision." I say, "Officer, I saw the 2 cars coming down the street. I heard a woman scream, and there was a collision." Are you and I contradicting each other?
No.
Thank you. We're offering 2 equally valid perspectives on what really happened. Just because one gospel talks about the trip to Egypt and the other is silent about the trip to Egypt, there is no contradiction between a statement in one book and silence in another. A contradiction would be, they went to Egypt, they never went to Egypt. Then we would have a problem.
But the massacre that Herod committed and the subsequent move to Egypt is a highly significant event.
Really?
In the context of this story they're telling about the birth of Jesus.
Of what significance to your life and my life today is it that Herod slaughtered a bunch of babies in Bethlehem?
Well, the problem here isn't the significance to our life today, but the significance to the story of Jesus. And on that point, it's actually fairly significant.
Please explain why.
Well, because they're trying to tell the story of the birth of Jesus, right? And in one story, there's this guy who wants to kill Jesus, so they have to run away to Egypt, and then in the other story, they never say anything about this guy, and they never say anything about going to Egypt.
If Jesus is God in human form, come to save you and me from despair, guilt, death, and hell, of what significance is it that Herod killed a bunch of people in Bethlehem?
Okay, so apparently me and you have different views on the subject of the importance of this particular subject.
Well, I have not heard from you an explanation of why it is so significant that Herod killed a bunch of babies in Bethlehem.
Because he was trying to kill Jesus.
Yeah, and he didn't succeed. He didn't succeed. Sir, do you know how many Jews were killed by Romans at that time? The Romans were barbaric people. The Romans slaughtered many Jews all the time. In fact, the Romans nailed Jews to crosses on a real regular basis. Just because the Gospels don't record all of that doesn't mean they're unreliable, because they didn't record that. See, history, sir, is a selective account of what happened. If someone writes a U.S. history book and doesn't include the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, is that automatically an unreliable U.S. history book?
Not necessarily.
Good.
If it claims to be a comprehensive U.S. history book, then certainly it's unreliable.
Okay. All right.
But that's not the only subject on which there is an inconsistency. Would you agree to me that Jesus' most important sermon is a significant event in his life, which any writer of the story of Jesus as the Son of God would want to include in their tale?
I can promise you, sir, we do not have a precise record of the most important sermon that Jesus taught.
Have you ever heard of the Sermon of the Mount? Sermon on... All right.
Yes.
That only appears in one of the Gospels. That's only in one of the Gospels. There's another sermon which is very similar in time and content in another of the Gospels, but that is delivered on the plains.
Yeah.
And then neither of the other two Gospels mention anything about it, and John the Baptist seemed to be unaware of it.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any idea how many years I have spoken in Austin?
No.
Good. Because it's been a lot. And I can promise you, over the past 20 years of speaking on this fine campus, I have repeated myself, I have said different things, and if someone were to write a record of what I've said out on this West Mall, it would be very different from what someone else would record, because I've said a lot, I've repeated myself, I've done some really unique things that I regret, that I'm not going to repeat. So, you're grappling with, what does it mean to give a record? And the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7 is not a claim that Jesus gave this thing all from beginning to end, and this was it. That Sermon on the Mount has a lot of different sayings that Jesus undoubtedly said not just once, not just on a mount, not just on a plain, sir, but a lot of other times. That's why the oral tradition was so strong, because Jesus repeated himself and repeated himself. He spoke in parables. I hope you don't think he gave the parable of the Good Samaritan just once.
No.
Good. So if one gospel writer were to record that Jesus gave the parable of the Good Samaritan on a mountaintop, and another would say he gave the parable of the Good Samaritan in a boat on the Sea of Galilee. Sir, that's not a contradiction. The same way that if someone records that Cliffe said this in one place, and he said the same thing in another place, that's not a contradiction, sir. It's not a problem. Right?
All right.
Okay, but let me make one quick more comment. You see, sir, I am very, very frustrated with the dishonesty of some, not all, some religion professors who critique the New Testament by doing exactly what you've just been doing. What I mean is, it is intellectually dishonest to have such a precise requirement that everything line up perfectly. And if everything doesn't line up perfectly, it's obviously erroneous. See, that's intellectually dishonest. Why? Because if you go to any other document and you apply the same stringent test to that other document that these religion professors are applying to the New Testament, you'd blow that book right out of the water. See, so the lack of ability to be consistent in those stringent textual criticism, that really disturbs me. I don't think it's intellectually honest.
All right.
Does that make any sense?
Yes. All right. So I'll waive the internal consistency bit for now.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you and I respect you. You need to hear me, okay?
Okay.
Sometimes talking to people, I feel like, man, they're not listening to me and we're not getting anywhere. But I really appreciate that.
All
and
right.
Respect you.
So there was internal consistency, writing
Literary style,
historical evidence, and
No. Internal consistency, literary style,
archaeological evidence, and
manuscript.
and manuscript
Yes,
evidence.
sir.
Yes. Isn't literary style more a function of how it is written, how it is chosen to be written, than any truth or falsehood of the tale?
Yeah.
All right.
Yes. But then it shows intent, right? If I say to you, once upon a time, and then I say to you, yesterday I was out here speaking on this West Mall.
Yes.
Those are two different claims. I better be honest in the intent that I'm communicating to you. You know, once upon a time, I'm not implying that this really happened. But if I say to you, yesterday, Tuesday, November 17th, I was standing out here and this is what I said, you better take that differently than when I say, well, you know, once upon a time, Hansel and Gretel went up a hill to fetch a pail of water.
Yes. So, but it doesn't change any of the content. It's just a matter of intent, right?
Well, yeah, but I mean, if my intent is to communicate to you truth about where I was yesterday, then I use a style that says, at this time in this place is where I was. If I say once upon a time, I'm not communicating specificity, I'm not communicating an accurate event.
Right. But the Bible has been translated many times, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and a lot of this translation was done by people who had an intent about the story, right? Mm-hmm. That, like, have you ever, the Council of Nicaea, I think, that there was a few people who specifically chose books, like books that had been written about Jesus, and took these together and said, this is the New Testament of the Bible. All right? So if you have a number of documents, and you want to choose, and they certainly had an agenda. They certainly believed that Jesus was God. So the ones that they choose would be the ones whose intent matched their own intent, wouldn't it?
Okay, great point. Dan Brown in the Da Vinci Code got a few things mixed up. The Council of Nicaea, sir, did not determine the New Testament. The Council of Nicaea struggled through the identity of Christ. How was the New Testament, the 27 books of the New Testament, put together? It was put together over a long period of time by the eyewitnesses, by those who knew the eyewitnesses, by those who knew them. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were accepted as authoritative right in the first century. They were read as authoritative. So were Paul's writings in the second century. Hebrews, 2 Peter, 2nd and 3rd John, Jude, lots of questions, into the 200s even. It was two councils at the end of the 4th century, in 393 and 397 AD, the Council of Hippo Regius and the Council of Carthage, that finally put their stamp of approval on what had already been decided. These 27 New Testament books are the New Testament canon.
All right.
So the council and
thank you for
Nicaea
the
had
correction. I must have mixed up some things I read.
It's all right. Don't worry, man.
So it's I'm having a hard time deciding how to put this.
Just put it out there.
Certainly there's a lot of... All right, have you ever heard of the story of George Washington cutting down the cherry tree?
Yeah.
All right. That never happened. That's not an actual thing that George Washington did.
Good. How do you know that?
Well, we know that because we know exactly who made it up. We know that there was a person who admired George Washington and wanted George Washington thought of as a great person, and he created this story.
Good.
And this happened 200 years ago.
Uh-huh.
And it's, something we've all heard and something we've all thought about. So this intentional creation of something that didn't happen to aggrandize a person,
Uh-huh.
we have records of this happening, like, all the time. So what makes you think that didn't happen to Jesus? That's...
Because the same tools that we use to determine George Washington did not cut down the cherry tree, we use to determine, did Jesus really live or not? What did he do when he was alive? Did he die on a cross? Did he rise from the dead or not? It's a study of history, which is a great study. And I love the certainty that you exhibited when you said, and we know that George Washington did not cut down the cherry tree. Why? Because we study history. And the historical record does not include that. That is a bit of folklore that grew up around George Washington. And guess what? We know the same thing about Jesus when it comes to the Gnostic Gospels. We've got Jesus in the Gnostic Gospels killing a playmate, then raising him back to life. We've got Jesus making some clay pigeons and turning them into real birds. And we know from the historical record in the first century, these are legends, folklore that grew up. We know Siddhartha Gautama Buddha did not believe in God. Well, you go into the homes of a lot of Buddhists, and they're worshiping gods. Well, that's not what Siddhartha Gautama Buddha taught. Siddhartha Gautama Buddha was agnostic, didn't believe in God. Well, how do we know that? By studying the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama Buddha. That's how we know that. So, we have ways called historical critical thinking of ascertaining what did Jesus really do, what did he really say, how did he die, how did he rise from the dead. That's how we do that and determine that.
Okay, so you're talking about Siddhartha Gautama Buddha, right?
Yeah.
All right. So, by the same standards that we know Jesus died and rose from the dead, we know Siddhartha Gautama Buddha achieved nirvana.
No. We don't know he achieved nirvana. But we know that he lived and that's what he taught.
All right. So we know that there is, that it is said that Jesus died and rose from the dead.
Well, eyewitnesses saw the man die on a cross. Eyewitnesses saw his body taken off the cross and put in a very, very public tomb, the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, who was a very well-known politician of the day. He was a ruler in Jerusalem. So this was not a secret little tomb somewhere. This was very well-known, tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. A stone was rolled in front, a Roman guard was set. So we know that this happened.
Is this mentioned anywhere outside of the Bible?
Yes. Josephus, the Jewish historian, talks about Jesus dying on a cross and supposedly rising from the dead, that was what was taught.
Does he say that was what supposedly happened?
No, he's pretty direct. He says, the guy rose from the dead. And the question is, well, then why wasn't Josephus a follower of Christ? So it's a hard question when it comes to what was going on there with Josephus. But I mean, he writes about it, about Jesus as an historical person. The letters of Paul were written between 48, 9, and 60 AD. So you've got Paul writing 1 Corinthians 15, where he writes that Jesus, he writes, what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance. that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised to life on the third day according to the Scriptures, that he appeared to Peter, James, the other apostles, and then he appeared to over 500 people who saw him risen from the dead. So Paul is writing this in about 50, 51, 52 AD, 20 years after the fact.
So I guess why don't you say God can be explained by science?
You bet. The reason I say that God cannot be explained by science is because of my definition of science. Science is based on the repeatability of an experiment. If you say it is something scientifically true, and we've proven it here at this fine university, but if you can't do those same experiments in London or in New York, you don't have science. Scientific knowledge is based on the repeatability of an experiment.